Hello, welcome to the Learning Playlist, a podcast for the major and general education courses under the tutelage of Mr. Ryan Dave Ryla, USJR College Instructor. This project is a supplement to the said courses and as a means to share knowledge to the public at large. To help the podcast grow, kindly follow us at facebook.com/the learning playlist. And now, on to our show. Hello, welcome once again to another lecture in European politics. Today we're going to talk about political culture. So now let us talk about what is political culture. Political culture as a subfield in the discipline of political science and of course attached to the subdiscipline as well of comparative politics. Political culture first surfaced in the work of Sidney Verba in 1963 called The Civic Culture, in which he studied different countries and how they basically interacted, how people and institutions basically interacted. So according to Sidney Verba, political culture is basically the system of empirical beliefs and expressive symbols and values which define the situation in which political actions take place. So the idea of political culture rose out of this study to provide orientation to politics, especially to individuals. So political culture is as an important aspect of understanding domestic politics, of understanding politics within a specific setting, aka a country or a state. Political culture is basically the intertwining of not only politics but also the social life of people in general and how they make meanings out of these social interactions, especially towards political institutions. And here we see that political culture is not simply a tool, but it is a means of interpreting the political system and how it works, not from the perspective of institutions per se, but from the perspective of people who have to interact with these institutions almost on an everyday basis for some, for others on a regular basis, say for example elections. So political culture is derived from the experiences of individuals. And although there are, let's say, political socializations later on, because learning about politics and of course gaining the ways and the means of culture in politics is not simply a one-way process. Rather, it's a continuing process from cradle to the grave, basically. So in this sense, the political culture derives from experiences of individuals. However, these experiences are not simply random, no? Some of these experiences tend to be rituals that individuals have to go through every day, or perhaps everyday rituals like flag raising, for example, or perhaps rituals such as elections that have to be conducted regularly. So one way to learn about political beliefs is to observe the ways in which political structure operates. So individuals having dealt with political structure, aka in the form of government offices, especially here in the Philippines, on the barangay level, for example, the closest levels of governance in this political system. So one way is to observe how these government offices, especially on the local level, operate on a daily basis. And these beliefs affect the way in which the structures operate, and there is a close circle of relationship between culture and structure. Okay, so this so-called relationship between structure and culture is actually we can also call this in another form as the structure and agency debate per se. in the sense that agency, which is embedded or found within individuals and communities, their choice, no, the choice that they have, choices that they make every day in regards to their daily outcomes, finding food, going to work, doing chores, etc., etc. And this also shapes structures, especially in how people conduct elections, for example. When can elections be conducted? And more importantly, what are the provisions needed by the local government to conduct these elections, etc., etc. Those are just examples of the relationship between culture and structure, because at the end of the day, culture becomes, let's just say, it becomes standard, it becomes the norm of, or the expected of how people interact when it comes to politics, know how they do their political interactions. A good example of structure and culture intertwining, or rather playing with one another, no, would be how local governments, especially in the Philippines today, conducts this these so-called not social amelioration, but how local governments in specific settings in the Philippines gives out what we call this. They give out um, aid money in communities, especially towards those who are marginalized in communities, most especially the PWDs and uh, and the older people, no, the elderly, who are given subsidies time and again. So you can see that structure has been shaped by the needs of these marginalized groups of people, and therefore the way that these structures are expected to operate eventually become culture. It becomes a part of the expectations of people. So culture can become, or culture is largely about expectations as to what the norm is in politics, that is. So political culture as a study is nothing new. Okay, it's nothing new. In fact, political culture has been written about by writers in the past, but they did not call it political culture per se. So the concept of political culture serves to focus our attention on an aspect of political life. We can even see traces of political culture being explained in terms of normative works of the ancient Greeks like Plato and Aristotle. In Plato's Republic, for example, we can see how Plato outlined his vision for the daily life of citizens in the Republic, especially the daily life or the regimen of the guardian class of society. So culture as a concept makes it easier for us to separate the cultural aspect of politics from other aspect, aka the aspect of institutions per se. Although, as we shall see, or as we are seeing, institutions or structures and culture are actually very enmeshed with each other, and in fact, they cannot exist without one another. No, so looking at politics from the cultural perspective, no, from the perspective of political culture, it becomes somehow tied to the world of ideas, or to the web of meaning that people make in daily interactions, such as political beliefs, um, their understanding of society, and it's focused on values and cognitions. And of course, there's the emotional commitment of people to their political institutions, in particular to their local community, for example, and to even some national sentiment that gives rise to political culture as an important lens in understanding political science, or rather in understanding politics today. And it is crucial in the study of political science today as well. When we talk about political culture, what is it that we focus upon basically? Political culture is not simply referring to formal or informal structures of political interactions, aka it's not talking about the way that local governments are structured and what kind of power sharing arrangement is there, etc., etc. Then who are the ruling parties, the opposition party? It's not simply about that. No? Although they can form part of the way we understand political culture. It's not simply limited to it. Rather than looking at political culture as embedded within the groups and of course the structure of government within a society, let us look at political culture as something, let's say, it is actually, how do I say this? It is actually embedded in the beliefs of people towards the political system and those who represent those systems. For example, in certain countries, there is patronage politics, and that means that institutions may be weak, no, government may be weak. However, it does not mean that there is no political culture going on. Rather, uh, political culture is embedded in the way that people interact and in the way that they make sense of who are the political actors. Now, what do they mean for them, etc. Giving meaning to units in politics, such as barangays, for example, or giving meanings to the actions of political actors is indicative of political culture as well, because it is about belief, and not only about belief, but the values behind those beliefs. So, political culture has its expressive and emotional dimensions as well. Okay? So, political culture forms an important link between the events of politics and the behavior of individuals in reaction to those events. So, political culture, in a sense, relates or fills in the gap of understanding politics not simply as a transaction, as a one-way transaction. No, it's not a closed circuit system of electronics wherein electricity simply passes, but rather the people involved in politics have agency as well. They have choice. And hence, here comes political culture informing those choices that individuals have to make. And in a way, although the political behavior of individuals is, of course, affected by acts of government, wars, elections, etc., it is more affected by the meanings that are assigned those events by observers. So political culture cannot be simply deduced to one-way transactions. It is full of meaning, and perhaps by understanding some of those meanings behind the actions of people, by understanding how they look at the world, how they view the world, then we can understand what kinds of choices are available to them and what actions they may take and what actions or choices they have taken as well. So, political belief is not merely how individuals respond to external events, but rather how individuals also process those external events and how they would react to those external events given the proper stimulus to regarding those events. So, basic belief system consists of existential beliefs, for example, or general values that set the goal of behaviors, and norms, societal norms, or expectations that regulate the means used to achieve goals, as well as emotional attachments. So these belief systems play a huge role in our political outcome and in the way that people interact politically with one another, especially towards governments. Right. So political culture also represents a system of control, because political culture is not simply created by individuals interacting. More often than not, political culture can be created by regimes or by systems of government, no, or by governments to reinforce their legitimacy. We will get to legitimacy in a while. To reinforce their legitimacy, to reinforce their so-called mandate, their authority to rule. So, in a way, political culture regulates who talks to whom and who influences who. So, in general, political culture is actually setting down rules as to who gets to talk about politics and what kind of discussions we have in public. In democracies at large, politics is the domain of the public and can be talked by everyone and can be the topic of everyone's discussion, but less so in authoritarian regimes where freedom of expression is curtailed by either by powerful military juntas or by individuals who have monopolized state power. So, political culture also regulates in the ways in which formal institutions operate, especially in the form of accountability, for example, in democratic systems, no? Wherein citizens can call out the actions of officials or can call out certain laws that have been passed into existence by the legislative or by actions of the executive, no? So in this way we can see that political culture helps us inform the way that politics is done in our country. It helps us set expectations, and more importantly, it helps us understand what is our role in society at large as citizens. So, in this way, political culture is also embedded in ideologies, in the way that people view themselves as stakeholders in politics. So, it is affected by cultural environment into which they are introduced. So, ideologies and of course the political cultures attached to them are adaptive, or rather are adapted to the political environment or to the environment that they are introduced in. Remember that politics and culture go hand in hand. So, in a way, political culture and of course political ideologies are path dependent as well. They are created due to specific events and specific policies, or even specific, let's say, beliefs that are embedded in people who practice them, etc., etc. And because of that, uh, political culture is malleable to changes, no? And since it is malleable, we can say that uh, culture and of course the ideas found within that culture can change. Whether it's abrupt change or gradual change, I cannot say, but it can change. No, it can change. It is malleable. So the big question now is, who creates culture, and how is culture reinforced? Or perhaps even, as I said, malleable, how is culture phased out eventually in a society? Who are the who are the formers of this culture? In our parlance today, who are the influencers behind political culture? Well, that process is largely called as political socialization. Okay? Individuals are suspect, or rather are expected to participate in political socialization because they themselves are not only socialized, but eventually they socialize others into the political processes of a country. So political socialization, defined here, is the process by which values, cognitions, and emotional commitments are learned in society. For example, in our elementary days, we are required to attend the flag raising ceremony almost on a daily basis. And not only the flag raising ceremony, but in the afternoon we are required to attend the lowering of the flag, no, in a public ritual. So in this sense, the process of political socialization is is not only a process that is something that we go through every day, but it is something that is, perhaps we can say, staged or recreated again and again to reinforce certain messages or to help us imbibe certain values that are desired by the community, that are desired by the nation state today. So the study of political culture leads inevitably to the study of political socialization, because we need to understand where this political culture is coming from, whatever their subcultures may be, to the learning experiences by which a political culture is passed on from generation to generation, and to the situations under which political culture changes. So it is really important to deal with political culture, but understanding political culture needs to be placed within the context as well of who organizes or um, who basically reinforces political culture in our communities today. Okay. So in Europe in particular, looking at Europe in particular, we tend to see political culture in Europe defined by these four characteristics, at least in let's say Western European standards, no? And of course in our current case studies in class. So we have the parliamentary systems, which are largely used in in Western European countries today. There are regional representations as well that are found in many European countries in case studies. Regional representation meaning that the country is divided into electoral districts with representatives coming from different regions or provinces per se, and these have become standard as part of their political history, as many of these regions have to fight hard either through military means or other means to be recognized, to be significant enough to gain representation in political bodies such as the Cortes, the Parliament, etc., etc. No, to be given a seat in the legislative body or the lawmaking body of the state. So that's regional representation. Centralization or decentralization of political power is also an important characteristic of Western European political culture, as we shall see that many of these European countries, especially in its recent history, have to contend with power sharing arrangements depending on what they have went through in the past century or so. What kind of power sharing arrangements between powerful, not only powerful factions within the state, but also between localities, no, between different regions of the state. What kind of power sharing agreements are there to ensure that everyone is at least satisfied with the compromise that is being set in their current political system? And of course, Western European political culture is largely tied to their post-colonial and post-industrial identities that have risen in the past half century or so. We have to remember that Western Europe, before it became developed as we understand it today, had to undergone major changes under colonization, imperialism, and of course the extraction of resources from colonies, from areas that they have colonized over the centuries. And this phenomenon of decolonization is fairly recent, as late as perhaps the 1960s, and this has a huge impact as to how Western Europeans, see themselves, and therefore it affects the way that they relate with their current governments right now. So these are the factors basically that shape European culture and identity, and I think we have covered them largely in the last discussion. But let me talk more about monarchies in general, and of course the ebb and flow of religions. Monarchies and religions have had, let's just say, they've had a partnership of sorts in the past, in the past hundreds of years or so, especially under the feudal system in Western Europe. However, as their power waned and as republican governments and republicanism eventually established itself in Western European countries, republicanism, what I mean by that is representative government, no, and it has no meaning or it has no connection with the current Republican Party in the United States right now. What I mean by republicanism again is these states have developed representative democracies in lieu of their absolute monarchies of the past. So in this way that monarchies and religion in Western European countries have been waning for at least the past 200 years or so. And because of that, there is a sort of a void in terms of who socializes people into the body politic. We have to remember that monarchies have served as great socializers in many European countries, and they continue to do so today, but their positions are increasingly challenged in a world that continually questions the need for their existence. So the prime concerns of European politics today are the following. Okay, so we have economic prosperity, social changes, and political representation. As for economic prosperity, we need to see Europeans as a people largely concerned with continuing prosperity, with continuing high levels of living standards that they have come to be accustomed to after the Second World War. And because of that, there is a need for continued access to cheap manufactured goods from countries that produce them, such as China and largely the countries of the global south. But as the global south is emerging from the let's say from the conditions of underdevelopment that they have experienced in the past decades, we are now beginning to ask, will this access to cheap manufactured goods remain as a reality for Europeans in the coming decades, or perhaps in the very near future? And of course, there's that concern of economic growth. And economic growth today is currently being challenged. No, at least its dogma of unlimited economic growth is being challenged by 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 climate change, and by, of course, by the narratives of sustaining this climate, of by sustaining this planet, or the narratives of sustainability. So European prosperity is coming into question, and whether there be transitions out of this remains to be seen. What kind of transition, I do not know. I cannot see that far into the future, unfortunately. There's also the concern of a common market versus sovereignty, and we clearly saw this in 2016 with the Brexit referendum that passed in the UK. And now there's a huge question as to what will happen in a European Union, no, a common market without Britain in it. And this is something that has become a huge friction point for many European countries today, not only with Britain and the European Union. There are also challenges of social changes, wherein immigrants from the global south are are entering the borders of many of these countries, usually legally. Then there's also the migrant crisis, however, which also fueled sentiments of nativism and, of course, veiled racism. But these concerns of immigrants coming to Europe from the global south is actually something that Europeans themselves have created, in the way that those immigrants wouldn't be coming to Europe, to Western Europe in particular, had they not known that Europeans were quite prosperous in the first place. No? So here's a sort of a twist of fates, wherein Europe once visited these far off countries in the global south, and now they are being visited, or they are being settled by countries from the global south. In a way, when we look at European politics today, there is this so-called new politics, in the sense that many Europeans are not only grappling with identity, no, identity, especially with those who consider themselves as natives of Europe, with European identity, but they're also grappling with many other identities, such as gender identity, even political identity, and many other aspects of politics. In the way, more and more people are asking for representation. They're asking for public spaces in which they can feel safe, etc., etc. So many social changes are occurring, and these social changes reflect the changing value system currently being updated or being overhauled in Europe today. Political representation also reflects the previous changes that are mentioned, especially when it comes to political legitimacy. Who has the right to rule? And as we have seen in the discussion earlier, or so you've heard in the discussion earlier, monarchies are being challenged whether they are legitimate or not. And these challenges to the monarchy is very salient, very important in today's time because the younger generation continually seek to to um, to challenge what is the role of the monarchy in today's modern world. And as you can see, many of Europe's monarchies, Western Europe's monarchies, are getting old, and it somehow it somehow provides us with a disconnect between tradition and progress per se. So there are many other aspects as well about political representation that we have discussed earlier as well. No? So we can see, for example, in the United Kingdom with Brexit, that many of these current concerns are present. And with Brexit, it's not only a social dilemma or a concern for social change that is going on, but it's also largely an economic concern, especially in the face of COVID-19. What kind of post-pandemic recovery will Britain have, especially considering Brexit, wherein they are no longer a part of the common market of the European Union? For France, there is also the rise of identity groups, those who say that they are part of perhaps let's say they are part of who consider themselves as nativists or nationalists per se. Sometimes the terms are interchangeable, and there are groups who actually contradict or who actually also fight for, let's say, a more multicultural and more liberal France, wherein people from different backgrounds can come and safely, let's say, they can safely settle in France regardless of their background. And many of these groups also claim um, they also claim traditions from the glory days of the French Revolution, in which men of different background and people of different background in general were asking for liberty, equality, and fraternity. So France has that long tradition of we can say perhaps some form of social justice, and we are seeing it today reflected in their politics and in the way they interact with their governments, and how these governments also react to certain political actions carried out by many social movements in France today, whether they be from the left or the right. In Germany, for example, there are also movements who um, who advocate for a more open and a more accepting Germany, especially towards immigrants. And then there are movements who also advocate for, let's say, an alternative for Germany. And this is actually the name of their coalition group, no, an alternative for Germany, in which they see that Germans um, should have or should uphold their own identity, because there has been a long-standing, um, let's say, not only tradition, but there's been a long-standing consensus in Germany, and currently this consensus is being challenged, that Germany uh, should renounce nationalism, especially extreme nationalism, in a way because of what happened during the Second World War and the Holocaust. In a sense that many factions across Germany and many groups across Germany are asking for a sort of alternative visions of what the Germany of the future might be, especially now that that Angela Merkel is stepping down. So as chancellor, her term is ending, by the way. So this is the huge question now. What kind of Germany would the Germany of the future be? Would it be a Germany for Germans, ethnic Germans per se, as some of these groups from the far right would claim? Or would it be a more multicultural, diverse Germany that many moderates and liberals want? In Spain, the problem of, or rather the quagmire of Catalonia still rages on today. Why am I calling it a quagmire, you may ask? Catalonia um, has been a long point of contention for many in Spain. For one, Catalonia wants to be independent from Spain, to separate from it, and yet the government in Madrid prevents it from doing so, despite the fact that there is wide support among Catalonians to secede from Spain. Many have argued that without Catalonia there would be no Spain, and many have also argued that Catalonia can stand up on its own. In a way, these arguments about what should be the future of Catalonia is best decided perhaps when stakeholders are consulted and not simply arrested, or even they're not simply struck down by the central power of the government in Madrid, no, of the national government. Catalonia as a region has a long history with Spain, but as to its future, we don't know what kind of future awaits Catalonia right now. But many people, especially in recent years, have been pushing forth the idea that Catalonia should be independent from Spain, and this is something that is uncommon in the modern world, wherein many parts or some parts of a state would secede based on on lines of identity. So this is political culture at work at large here, not only in Spain, but also in the different case studies presented earlier. For Italy, there's been a mix of different concerns that have been expressed by its people, but perhaps more concerning would be the concern on, or more urgent, no, more important would be the concern on the so-called Green Pass, wherein many Italians are questioning if their government is discriminating them based on whether or not they got the vaccine. And of course, many Italians, some would say they opted not to get the vaccine, etc., etc. So this concern about vaccines and these concerns about getting green passes, or basically a vaccination card to go to work, to go to places, etc., etc., has been a huge issue among Italians, especially in their political scene today. So in a way, we can see that the way that people view the vaccines and the way that they react to how the government has enforced mandates about vaccines is also part of their current political culture as well. So on that, I hope you had listened well to this lecture and have understood a great deal about what political culture is and what legitimacy is all about. So in that regard, I guess we'll have to end this lecture here. Thank you for coming, and I will see you on the next one. Bye.